Hey class, good to be back with you. Semester is rolling right along and we're here already in chapter number 4, which means we're just about 25% or so through the semester, so things are moving right along. Hope you had a good Labor Day break. Um, but at the same time, I want you to make sure that you're staying on top of your calendar, making sure that you're getting your work done timely. I did notice some assignments turned in late. Please correct that. Make sure that you are turning your assignments in before the deadline. And if you're having some problem, please give me a shout out and let me know, and I'll do what I can to help you. Okay, so we're at chapter 4. Chapter 3, again, we talked about federalism, which is discussion of the division of power between states and the federal government. So by now, you should have a very broad overview of the Constitution, how our government is divided up between the three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. And so now, as we go forward, we're going to be talking about our government in more specific ways. In chapter 4 specifically, we're going to be talking about civil liberties. And when we use the word civil liberties, that is not synonymous with civil rights. Civil liberties and civil rights are two different things. When we talk about civil liberties, we're talking about specific individual rights such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, so forth and so on, that are constitutionally protected against government intrusion. Those are civil liberties. Then, of course, when we talk about civil rights, we're talking about how the government treats various groups, religious groups, racial groups, sexual groups, etc., etc. And is the government treating those groups equally? All right, because our Constitution is written in such a way to guarantee us that we have equality before the law, because as human beings, we have all the moral value. We have equal moral value. We may have differences in education. We may have differences in income. We may have differences in talents, but in the eyes of the law, we should all be equal. And of course, we know that that's an ideal theory that isn't carried out to perfection in everyday life. That's why if you look at the scales of justice, the Department of Justice emblem, the Lady Justice, she's blind. And she's blind because it should not matter what color, what gender, nothing should matter. We should all have moral equality before the law. Okay, so when the Constitution was written in its original form, there was no Bill of Rights. And then, as we have already studied, shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, there were 10 amendments added to the Constitution, and we refer to those 10 amendments as the Bill of Rights. Those Bill of Rights did not apply to actions by the state. In its original state, the Bill of Rights only applied to actions by the federal government. So what that means is that the U.S. Constitution did not provide you protection from the state's actions that might interfere with your right to have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, so forth and so on. So if those rights were guaranteed, your protection from those rights being inhibited by the state was dependent upon the state constitution. However, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment did two things. First of all, it defined citizenship, and second of all, it applied the Bill of Rights to actions by the state. So the 14th Amendment ensured that the state had to protect the Bill of Rights in the same manner that the federal government did. Now, I hope that you have are reading your chapter, and you are learning somehow the Supreme Court throughout American history has applied those Bill of Rights and interpreted those Bill of Rights in different ways. So I want to talk about the first freedom, one of the first rights found in the Bill of Rights, and that is the freedom of speech, or the freedom of free expression. Um, and your question this week on the discussion board is about should the burning of the American flag be protected as free speech? Why or why not? And let me say this about your discussion board in this particular subject. Please take your emotions out of it. I think, in my opinion, is has very limited value. Okay, I want you to not mention my uncle, my grandpa, my dad, my brother, or we served in the military. All that's fine and good, but it doesn't serve to make a point. You need to make a constitutional um, basis. You need to make a constitutional argument as to whether or not the burning of the flag should be allowed as free speech. Now, all of us have certain opinions and certain emotions, and certainly when we see the flag disrespected, it does bring up certain emotions. But I don't want to read a bunch of discussion boards about, that makes me mad, and my grandpa fought in World War II, and so forth and so on. That's really irrelevant to the discussion. What I want to know is, can you take the Constitution and support the idea that flag burning is constitutional, or protected by the Constitution, or if you can take the Constitution and prove that flag burning is not protected for free speech. Give me an argument about why it is not protected as free speech. Please do not let your rationale simply be that it offends someone. Okay, so prior to World War I and World War II, there was really very little concern about free speech. And then all of a sudden, the United States gets involved in these two world wars. And of course, if you study American history, we find that during the course of these wars, there were enemy spies that came into the United States. And so the Department of Defense, in particular World War II, started a whole campaign called Loose Lips Sink Ships. And there were posters and warnings and advertisements on the radio reminding people that you should not, if you know something about where troops are stationed, or where ships are at, so forth and so on, you shouldn't talk about that in open. Because you never knew who might be listening to your conversation, and that information be all that the enemy would need to know to harm our troops or to win a battle. So following World War II, then there was this big concern over communists, and when we study that, we call that the Red Scare, and it's sort of an interesting study if you ever have a chance to study post World War II America. Americans became very, very convinced that at the top of the agenda for the Soviet Union was the conquering of America. So again, that Red Scare really led to Americans fearing what was being said, and the government wanting to control or limit what was being said. So the Supreme Court allowed the government to suppress, after World War II, allowed the government to suppress speech that was deemed to be subversive. In 1951, the court affirmed convictions of 11 members of the U.S. Communist Party who was calling for the overthrow of the American government. And under federal law, it was illegal to call for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. After the 50s, though, there wasn't anyone that was convicted of subversive speech. The court also protected speech against actions by the state. Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969, Clarence Brandenburg had been convicted of saying that revenge might be taken if the national government continues to suppress the white Caucasian race. Pardon me. The court reversed his conviction under the Ohio law and said that free speech cannot be prohibited unless it meets a two-part test. And we call this two-part test imminent lawless action. So for speech to be inhibited, it has to, number one, be directed at causing an imminent lawless action, and number two, it must be likely to produce such an action. Okay, so it has to be aimed at inciting an illegal action, and it has to meet the criteria that it's likely to produce that illegal action. In 1992, the Supreme Court struck down a St. Paul, Minnesota law that made it a crime to engage in speech that was likely to arouse anger or alarm on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. Again, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment does not apply to the hate crimes law. Then in Snyder v. Phelps in 2011, some of you are probably familiar with the name Pastor Fred Phelps, who was the pastor of the Westboro Baptist Church. And if you watch the news, you know that Westboro Baptist Church are very well known for protesting at the funerals of soldiers that have been killed, carrying signs that say that it's the judgment of God on America because of war, or the judgment of God because of homosexuality, so forth and so on. They protested at the funeral of a soldier by the former Marine by the name of Matthew Snyder, who'd been killed in Iraq. And Snyder's dad sued Westboro Baptist Church and won, and was awarded $5 million by a federal grand jury. But the court overturned that ruling 8-1, saying that speech is protected even if it is offensive. And I think that's something important that we as government, students, and citizens of the United States need to remember, is that we have freedom of speech, not just to say things that everybody likes, but we have the freedom to say things that is even offensive. For instance, the Supreme Court ruled in Skokie, Illinois, that which was a majority, or at least a very large Jewish population in Skokie, Illinois, and the American Nazi Party wanted to hold a rally there, and the Supreme Court supported that, saying that they could not be prevented from having free speech or free assembly just simply because their speech or their gathering or their cause is offensive. And you look at our culture today, there is much attempt to, within our popular culture and within our government, to suppress anything that is considered offensive. And the fact of the matter is that no matter what you and I say, it's going to offend somebody somewhere. Someone's not going to agree with us. But then again, in particular in places like colleges and universities, isn't that part of the experience, is hearing someone else's voice, getting the other side of the coin, the flip side of the coin, if you will, and being disagreed with, and somehow in the middle of all of that, coming to a better understanding and a better conclusion that we would have on our own. So when you talk about burning the flag, talk about it in legal terms, in constitutional terms. Don't simply talk about it in terms of emotions and rhetorical questions or statements. Talk about it in terms of, is it constitutional? If you say that it is constitutionally or legally protected, please tell me why. And oh, by the way, make sure that you are citing sources, whether they be online sources. Don't cite Wikipedia ever, 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 ever in any academic work. Whether it be online sources or whether they be your textbook or some other book. Make sure that you are citing those. Again, if you want to know how to cite, there's a sample that has been attached to the welcoming page here on our Blackboard course. Make sure that you go look at it. And always, if you're having trouble with something, need something explained further, please make sure, send me an email. You can email me directly at my Carl Albert email address, mkwomack@carlalbert.edu. You can use the classroom email to contact me as well, or you can call me on my office phone. I'm in class on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday until noon, so make it afternoon. My number is 918-647-1454, and I hope to see you in the future.